Welcome to this session on media matters and whether it does matter or not. I think we are going to have a good discussion here. I'm not Monideepa Banerjee, who's unfortunately fallen ill. I wish her a speedy recovery, and I wish she was here. I'm sure she'll be fit and fine soon. So I'm standing in for her, and this book, uh, Framing the Media by Pamela Philipose, is so thoroughly well researched. So congratulations, Pamela. Really good reading, and really it gets you to understand what framed the media in India. So my first question to you, and I'm going to ask you a few provocative questions so that
I'm
your
ready for
thoughts
them,
come out.
Sujata.
Yeah. Does media really matter? How does it matter? To whom does it matter, really?
Yeah. So before I answer that question, I want to actually link up with what Pavan told us just a little while ago. The limit of toleration and our traditions of being able to discuss every idea in the public sphere. The question is, do we have that right now? And my submission in this book is that if you trace the entire arc of Article 19(1)(a), which is the guarantee, and I think there were many references to it in the previous session, of the Constitution, and that guarantee of the right to freedom of speech and expression. Now, when the founding fathers and mothers talked about expression, they brought in speech, but they brought in expression because they were looking for the full gamut of public intercommunication. And this is something that we have forgotten, unfortunately, over the last few years. That is my submission. So to get back to your question, which you will remind me about again.
Does media matter? How does it matter? To whom does it matter?
So precisely because of this, the media matters. And unfortunately, the media itself has made itself not matter. Over a period of time, the media has dissolved itself almost in the ocean of politics. And as a result, its own voice has been lost. And I think as a society, it is our job to recover that voice, because a democracy needs that voice. Unfortunately, we have lost it, Sujata. I mean, that is my basic premise. And we've lost it at different points of our journey as a post-independent country. Pavan was speaking a little bit earlier about the Constitution and the Constitution making. And Constitution making actually hinged a lot on this fundamental right of speech and expression. And today, when you talk about it, it's almost non-existent. And the worry is that we have gone past recovery. And unless we are, involved in this big tragedy facing us as a country, it may be too late. That's my worry.
Yes, Pamela. I was also wondering, in your opinion, is there any state in India, is there any country in the world where true freedom of speech and expression exists?
Now, one could say that India itself was not ready to give up on truth and freedom. One of the major things about our constitution making was this right that was protected by our founding fathers and mothers. Unfortunately, we have slowly beginning to lose it. And unless we understand that, It'll be difficult. Now, you're saying that nowhere in the world is speech and expression
No,
protected.
I'm asking you. I'm not saying.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, since you're asking me, then I would say that there is an attempt to recognize the importance of freedom of speech and expression in a democracy. A democracy without speech and expression is no democracy. Unfortunately, even a country like the US, which has the First Amendment, is we know, being considerably undermined. I mean, the ability of people to speak is being considerably undermined by a system presided over by, you don't associate dictators with the American system, but in a sense, Trump is a dictator. I think we need to understand that in many ways. And he's been able to convince his base that he's speaking the right language. But as we know, he's using the weapons of war very often to drive his point home. And I think speech that is coerced in this manner is no speech at all. And I think our ability to critique other countries should not come in the way of our ability to critique our own country. And that, I hope, is what we are going to concentrate on, because everywhere across the world, free speech is under threat. We know that. Partly because of the nature of the new media as well. So perhaps we can revisit that. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. So in our own country,
Yeah.
how much time can you spend watching television? And also, reading the different digital news platforms. And which channel do you really believe in? Do you really trust? You've written about in your book
Yeah.
all of this, so I want you to say this.
Yeah. The point is that we set our Constitution, of course, protected freedom of speech and expression. And there were many people amongst our founding fathers and mothers who had insisted that this is a cardinal principle of our democracy. And there were people who argued for making it even more rigorous at the time when these discussions were there. And I think we should remember that all our amendments, everything, all our rights that we have got is through this process of argumentation. The Constituent Assembly was not an elected body, but it was composed of people who had gone through the experience of partition and were determined, not all of the Constitution making happened slightly before the partition and then, of course, post the partition. So it was a period of 2 years roughly. But during that time, there was tremendous focus on our right to freely express ourselves as a country. Now, remember, at that point, the vote, not every country in the world had the right to vote. Women didn't have equal rights to vote in some countries. And the Constitution making itself was a revolutionary process which brought people of different aptitudes, different, extractions together to try and imagine a country in which freedom of speech and expression is central, and so also the freedom of all the various other freedoms, including freedom of faith and all the other things that make India what it was. Unfortunately, it may not be what India is today, but it was. At least the concept that the partition and that its document, we can see, in a sense, the Constitution as a document of partition, because the lessons learned during partition were inherent in in that document.
So Pamela, with little bit of skepticism and a lot
Okay.
of belief in what you have written,
Yeah.
and particularly on page 123 of your book,
Okay.
if you'd like to read out at least the first paragraph of that page,
Okay.
then we will then see
Okay,
how
let me
much we
try and read
trust.
it. Which
Yeah.
one? Which one is that?
Just this one.
Okay. Meanwhile, the police made full use of the amended provisions of the IT Act. Now, we are talking of India in the many years after independence and the Constitution. The IT Act of 2000, as testified to by innumerable cases filed subsequently. In the year 2012 alone, governments and police authorities in various parts of the country resorted to Section 66A in an almost cavalier manner. At least 6 prominent cases were to surface.
Yes, come on.
Okay? This is like being in school again, but I enjoy it. Thank you. In April that year, a Jadavpur University professor who had incurred the wrath of the Chief Minister of West Bengal for sharing on social media a cartoon which showed her in a bad light, faced arrest. It took him almost 10 years of litigation to get the case dismissed. Do I continue?
Yeah, the other ones.
In May, 2 members of Air India's cabin crew were jailed for 12 days for circulating online already published jokes about politicians, including the Prime Minister, and for insulting the national flag. In September, there was a well-publicized case involving a young cartoonist, Asim Trivedi, who was imprisoned under various laws, including 66A, for a cartoon that appeared on his website and Facebook page, which trenchantly critiqued the Indian Parliament. That November, a young Palghar-based woman, Shaheen Dada, posted a comment on Mumbai, having shut down over the death of Bal Thackeray, Shiv Sena founder. She ended her post with a comment, "Today, Mumbai shuts down due to fear, not due to respect." Not only was she arrested, a friend of hers, Renu Srinivasan, who had liked her post, was also taken into custody.
Okay.
So actually, those are important points.
So, Pamela, where does freedom of speech exist?
No, the very fact that the courts had to weigh in on these and had to overturn them, 66A was thrown out only because of the resistance of ordinary people to this imposition on their right to freedom of speech and expression. So I see that actually not as a moment of down, but a moment of up, because it meant that this clause, this section, was not seen as part of the constitutional ethos and was therefore thrown out. And that's a moment of triumph for us. Yeah.
Okay, so a lot of belief in the media, including trial by media.
No, I'll tell you what, I'm not a votary for the media per se, because the media itself, we know, is made of different stripes. And we know that what I tried to do in this book was to actually trace the arc across the ages. So we know that one of our first attempts to control speech was far before independence. It was in the late decades of the 18th century. And after which we had the colonial state. The colonial state was known as a state of opinion. And it actually controlled opinion in considerable ways. So we have, over a period of time, laws brought in to actually control our speech. We know, for instance, that the British were really worried about the vernacular press because they felt that the English language press they could control. But the vernacular press was what needed to be really locked in. So they came up with the Vernacular Act, controlling the vernacular press. And none of this, I mean, for years, nothing could be done about it. It needed the whole rise through our independence movement to actually make Indians rediscover that speech, their speech was as precious to them as their freedom. Because very often, speech and freedom are synonymous. And that is what we should recognize, and that's what we should embrace. And if my book helps to establish this, I would say I've done a job. A job. Not a good job. Please note. A job. An important job, just so that other people know that what we have in that document we call the Constitution, with its Article 19(1)(a), is so vital for our democracy. We cannot consider, we are in fact, even this assembly, we are a public sphere. We are different people talking different things. But it's our ability to talk. I'm speaking without expectation of the police rounding me up and taking me away for actually saying that we have lost our speech today in many, many ways.
So, yes, you also, you've not just done a job, you've done a great job. Your research is really fantastic. So, I'll say that again and again. But there are a lot of things in the sphere of the media which worry all of us. So, for instance, advertisers and owners of different hues control the media.
Of course.
And what is published there.
Thank you.
It?
Thank you for that
Yeah.
question, because we know that very often it is the ability of people to speak beyond the publisher that has become important today. And that's why self-communication in today's world is as important as mass communication. So that apart, we should understand what is happening when we say that that the state would like to control how we think, because power and the ability to think go hand in hand. And we know that some of the first pushbacks, everyone talks of the emergency, and I think we should start there, because that was the first time when we realized that something we took for granted was no longer there. I see Bachi here, and it's wonderful to have you here, Bachi, but you know what happened during the emergency. I would like to remind you that during the emergency, I had just joined the Times, just as what do you call it? What were we called, Bachi? A trainee journalists. We were all being trained. And at that time, what happened was that suddenly I came into the room and there was quietness. Normally the newsroom, and Bachi would know that, the Times of India had a bustling newsroom. And it was like a big concourse, twice the size of this particular area. Can you imagine? Right across VT Station, giving a challenge to VT Station in terms of its spread. And it was always lively. You could hear people talking about the teleprinter. In those days, the teleprinter would go kak, 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 always as a background to our work. It was one of those periods. And I was a trainee still, and I came to silence. There was nothing stirring that day. And then I asked someone, because everyone's speaking in whispers, so I whispered, "What's happening?" So then they said, "The emergency has been declared." Now, I was trained in the Indian Institute of Mass Communication. And I was taught a lot about many things, including laws and so on. But what I didn't know was thank you. What I didn't know was the emergency. What is the emergency? You know, that was something none of us were prepared for. And we had to learn. And I remember at that point, Kushwant Singh, who was editing and Bachi's boss, he came down from the 3rd floor. We were on the 2nd floor. I was in the Times. I was training the Times. And he came back. He had a fine, baritone. And he told us, I'm stopping my publication for 2 weeks at least. And we all looked at, in admiration, this man who could take on the might of the Indian state. We looked at him. He said, for 2 weeks, this can't go on. Within a week, maybe Bachi could fill the story in, but as I remember, within a week or two, the magazine was coming out. And within 2 months or so, we had cover stories of Sanjay Gandhi. So that little excitement, that we could resist, was blown away. And so, I mean, these are learning experiences. And no one could emerge out of this. I remember someone saying, every time we saw me, my friends, we knew that they had a petition somewhere up there under them. They always had petitions because they were always petitioning. But we knew it was a losing battle. And during the emergency, everyone was hushed. Even that famous newsroom that was so buzzing with life was quiet. But let me tell you, the journalists of that era conducted them with far greater credibility and courage than the journalists of today. Many of them didn't write during that period. Shamlal, for instance, the editor of the Times of India, he didn't write anything against the emergency. But his protest was not writing anything under his name. Nothing under his name came out. It was only after the emergency was lifted did he write a long, long editorial saying just what went wrong those days, how silence had affected the mind of journalists. It was a really tragic moment for us. It was tragic because we had lost our tongues. And not just us, it went across the board. People were jailed. We've heard of Kuldeep Nair and others. But it was also the emergency that kind of gave us the courage to, once it was lifted, to actually use our voice. And some of the best journalism that we, today cite really emerged during that time. You know, that whole pushback. You've heard of the Kamla story, I think, because it was made into a film. The Kamla story is an example of that pushback that happened as a result of the emergency. Editors decided we have to, in this case, I think it was Arun Shourie, you have to go out and get the story as it happened. And so you had this journalist from the Times go to Madhya Pradesh and buy a woman from open market and bring her. I mean, by today's standards, it may seem a bit off because you exposed the woman, you didn't protect her dignity, nothing. But it showed you that women were up for sale, and it was so brilliantly exposed to the world. So we had a very amazing journalism during that period. But that period, I think, over a period of time, that kind of I think it went its own way. And then, of course, you had many other forces we can talk about, yeah.
So, Pamela, we all hope that that kind of courage survives and grows stronger 40 years after the emergency. And 40 years, nearly 40 years after the emergency, we also have the media as social media and a totally new environment of people writing and people consuming. And you've written about it in your book and the laws that are continuously changing and trying to govern that voice. So just a little bit on that.
So if you trace that arc, as I have tried to do, the whole, the print media had its own compulsions. The way to control print media in those days was not just the emergency. Newsprint was used because newsprint was a raw material on which news came to you. And it accounted for 50% of the costs of bringing out a newspaper. So it was very, very important. And it wasn't produced in India. It had to be imported. And very often, there was no foreign exchange to buy enough of it. So there was a lot of effort by the government to control newsprint. So there was a pushback at that stage as well, there are many stories entangled with newsprint, but let me go on. Then we went to radio and television. Now look at the radio and television. To this day, news on radio is not controlled by the people who produce it. I mean, independent voices are not there. It is the government that controls news on radio. To this day, so many years, so many decades after independence, we still have that. And that's worrying. Television followed a slightly different trajectory because it was seized as it was privatized. And therefore, television news came to emerge as an entity. But television news itself, that television is one of the most expensive media. And precisely because of that, television news cannot be trusted. Because who wants to know about the media? Television media. The television media was completely undermined. And we know that, for instance, look at the way it is controlled by private interests, television. So we have television going the way of kind of representing the interests of people who own the channel. So there was that. Now, digital media had something very interesting, Sujata. That is that it was relatively cheaper. It didn't have the overheads that television needed. And therefore, you had a relative independence. What the internet gave the journalist was the ability, not just the journalist, the ordinary person, the ability to self-communicate. Otherwise, it was one-to-many. The people who own these big media companies, would give you their news. Suddenly, you had the ability to counter them. And that was something quite amazing, that ordinary people suddenly had the right to speak, And, but something happened in the process. Many people took over this ability. And we know, for instance, powerful interests like the BJP's IT cell and so on try to control, digital media. So now when the digital media is controlled and what is put out on digital media is controlled, you have a lot of, blowback. And you were asking me
about the DPDP Act, the Digital Personal Data Protection Act, and all the other, the broadcasting bill, and all the other things that are going to...
So you see, what happened was that the state, since it could not control, it had already controlled the legacy media. Print was completely controlled. through various ways, when, for instance, Prime Minister Narendra Modi he realized, during the, I think a reference was made to the Gujarat riots. At that point, you had people like Barka, Rajdeep and others, go across to Gujarat and grill the people they felt were responsible for the violence unleashed. Now, as a result, the Prime Minister learnt one very important lesson. Here was a person who understood the nature of the media in ways that I don't think any other Indian politician understood it. He realized that he has to turn the tables on the established media, on the legacy media. We've all heard of the Karan Thapar interview. I don't know if you've all heard of it, but it is a defining moment because he asked some very crucial questions to the Chief Minister of Gujarat, who found it difficult to answer and actually said, I need a glass of water. He had that sip of water and he said, I'm not going to continue with this interview. So at that point, he made a decision. He will not engage equally with the legacy media, with the print media, with anyone who asks him questions. He will instead communicate directly. And that was what he did so effectively because he realized, in 2009, he was already on Facebook. He was already on Twitter. He realized the importance of new media. Why? Because, like I said, it gave him the ability to self-communicate. And once he had this tool of communicating one-to-many, as one-to-many, he knew that he could then depend on that to convey his thoughts. That's why he doesn't have a press conference. To this day, he has not had a press conference, throwing himself open. That's the difference between, say, Trump. Trump, we know, has his own agenda. But he takes questions. He takes questions. And you may have noticed that very often he's nasty to people who pose these questions to him. But he takes these questions. And that is the important thing. And that's the important difference between the system. I think you were asking me, what's the difference? The difference is this, that there are countries that take this capacity of the citizen to ask questions of the government more seriously than we have. We have allowed, this was something that was ordained in our constitution, but we have let it go. And I often say, it's so sad that people have not come out on the streets to fight for the right to freedom of speech and expression. When was the last time you heard people come out and say, why are we being muzzled? Why? Has it become an election issue? Although it should have. It is so vital for our democracy, but it has never become an election issue. And I would urge us as a public sphere, in this room, we are a public sphere, that we ask questions of people who govern us.
Thank you, Pamela. We're being told the time's up.
Okay.
And
it
there
was
are
enjoyable talking to you. I could have
hundreds
gone
of
on.
questions that everyone would have on this subject.
Yeah.
And everyone has an opinion on this subject,
Yeah.
and it's important that they do. Thank you so much, and
Yeah.
thank you for the book. I would recommend that
Most
those who are
welcome.
interested even a little bit in freedom of expression and freedom of speech have a go at reading this book. Thank you so much.
Thank you for being such a lovely, lovely audience. Thank you.